You know that feeling of standing at a counter, doing math you already know won't balance, and doing the thing anyway. Everyone around you has already decided what your life adds up to. This is the story of someone who looked closer than anyone else bothered to, and staked the last of what she had on it. Here's where it begins. The chicks came off the dealer's truck a strange, smoky blue-gray, barred like no bird anyone in Briar Hollow had raised in 30 years. Not the yellow fuzz of ordinary stock, not the red-brown of the layers most farms kept. Iris Calder stood at the feed counter with $4.11 in her coat pocket, and she was looking at those birds the way a person looks at something they're not supposed to want. She had come to the co-op to price cracked corn, not to buy anything. The household account, what was left of it after 2 winters of running her father's farm alone, held $19, and $19 did not stretch across seed, corn, and whatever the traveling truck happened to be selling that Tuesday. She had learned that arithmetic the hard way in the 2 years since Elmer Calder's heart had given out in the hay barn and left her the deed, the debts, and 81 acres she had never expected to run by herself. She had gotten good at stretching things. Good at making a 50-pound bag of feed last 60 pounds worth of days. Good at patching fence with baling wire instead of buying new. Good at telling the man at the bank, twice now, that the spring would be better than the fall had been. She did not always believe it when she said it. She said it anyway, because the alternative was to stop saying anything at all, and she had watched what happened to farms where the person left standing stopped saying anything at all. The dealer's truck carried the usual mix that spring: 2 shoats, a crate of ducklings, a stack of laying hens nobody wanted because they were coals from a bigger operation 2 counties over. Iris passed the shoats without a second look. She passed the ducklings, doing the sum on ducklings the way she did the sum on everything now, quickly and without sentiment. Then she reached the last crate at the tailgate, and the barring on those chicks caught the morning light in a way that made her stop walking. "What are they?" she said. It was not really a question. It was the sound a person makes when they already know they are about to do something foolish and want one more second before they do it. The dealer was a heavy-set man who had clearly answered the question before, more than once, in more than one county. Fella outside Danville had a whole yard of them, some old breed his grandmother kept going. Rose comb, see, not the single kind, sits low and tight to the skull. Barred like that clear down to the skin, not just the feathers. He's getting on in years, didn't want to winter them again. He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who had decided a thing was worth exactly what someone would pay for it, and not a cent more. Nobody local wants a chicken that don't look like a chicken. How many in the crate? 14. $4 for the lot. Since I can't seem to move them anywhere, I've stopped. $4 was every dollar in her coat, and the corn she had come for was not optional. The corn was the difference between the flock she already had eating through the week or not. Iris did the sum anyway, standing there, the way she had learned to do sums since the funeral, quickly and without asking anyone's permission, because there was no one left to ask. She thought about her father, who had told her once, hauling scrap lumber off a fence line nobody else wanted, that the strange thing in front of you was either worth nothing or worth everything, and that standing around trying to guess which one it was never once told you the answer. The only way to find out, he'd said, was to take it seriously enough to risk being wrong about it. She bought the chicks. She drove home with 14 bar birds crated on the passenger seat and no money left for corn, and she did not spend the drive worrying about the corn. She spent it looking sideways at the crate every time she came to a stop sign, at 14 pairs of eyes that were, even at that age, unmistakably alert. The specific kind of alert that meant a bird was paying attention to the world rather than simply enduring it, which was, she would think later, not so different from the difference between the 2 ways a person could run a farm. She built the brooder herself that same afternoon, out of scrap lumber stacked against the east wall of the barn and a heat lamp sheet, kept from a broiler batch 2 summers back that had mostly died of a neglect she hadn't had the hours to prevent. She fed the new chicks the same crumble she fed everything else because that was what she had, and she watched them the way she had not watched anything a long while. Not out of duty, the way she watched the fences and the weather and the bank balance, but because she wanted to. At the co-op the following week, 2 of the Tullis brothers laughed when she mentioned what she'd bought. Not unkindly, exactly, the way men laugh at something that confirms what they already believed about a young woman running a farm on her own, but it landed the way it landed. "Bar nothing chickens," one of them said. "You pay Danville money for a chicken nobody's kept since before the war." Iris did not argue. She had learned, in 2 years, that arguing cost more than it returned. She bought her seed, said her goodbyes, and drove home to birds that were, by then, 3 weeks in a feathering out a pattern like wood smoke against slate. Silas Mara came by the fence line that Saturday, the way he had been coming by roughly twice a week since the funeral, ostensibly to talk about the shared boundary drainage, and actually, Iris suspected, because he had appointed himself a kind of unofficial watchman over whether she was managing. He farmed the section north of hers, ran it well, and wore, most days, an expression of careful concern that had become, over 2 years, a permanent fixture of their conversations at that fence. "Heard you bought birds off the Danville dealer," he said. 14, she said. "The bar ones. Nobody around here's kept that line in years, not since my grandfather's time." "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it Tuesday. I just knew they were the only birds on that truck actually looking at anything." He looked at her for a moment, the dark, careful look he wore whenever he was deciding how hard to push. "You've got $4 to your name this week." Iris had $4. "Had," she said. "Now I've got none and 14 chickens." He didn't say anything for a moment, which was, for Silas, its own kind of statement. "Come back in the fall," he finally said, "and tell me I made the right call not arguing with you about it at the co-op." "I will," she said, and went back to the barn and did not think much about the exchange again for several weeks, because there was corn to figure out and a coop to expand and, underneath all of it, a feeling she had not had in 2 years, the sense that she was building something instead of simply enduring it. The birds grew fast, faster than the culls she'd kept the winter before, and by 6 weeks the barring had come in dense and sharp, distinct in every feather, deepening in the morning light and flattening to something almost silver by evening. The rose combs sat low and close to the skull, built, she would later understand, for exactly the kind of Oakridge County winter that split ordinary single combs down to frostbite by January. She hadn't known that when she bought them. She had known only that they looked like something worth paying attention to, and that had turned out to be reason enough. The first eggs came in early June, brown-shelled and dense, heavier in the hand than anything her culls had ever produced. She cracked one into a bowl at the kitchen table and sat looking at the yolk longer than she meant to, deep, almost orange, sitting up thick the way a fresh, well-fed egg does. She did not need a scale to know it was different. She scrambled it plain, the way she'd learned to test anything new, without butter or salt clouding the answer, and ate it standing at the stove because there hadn't been time to sit down properly in longer than she could remember. Then she went out to the coop and counted nests. 10 of the 12 hens had laid that day. She wrote the number down in the notebook her father had used for the wheat on a page that had, until that morning, only ever tracked what the land was failing to produce. She brought 6 eggs to Opal Finn's store in a cloth-lined basket the following Monday. Opal had run the Briar Hollow General Store for better than 20 years and had priced eggs by hand and by eye for most of them. She picked one up, turned it, weighed its heft against a memory of 10,000 other eggs, and cracked it into the bowl she kept behind the counter for exactly this purpose. "Lord," Opal said. "That's about what I thought," Iris said. "Where are these off of?" "Some old bar breed. Rose comb. I bought 14 chicks off the Danville dealer back in March." Opal looked at the yolk a while longer, the way a person looks at a thing they are recalculating the value of in real time. "How many are you laying now?" 10 a day, out of 12 hens. 2 turned out roosters. "I'll take everything you can bring me," Opal said, at 32 cents a dozen. The going county rate that June was 14. Iris told her she'd need 2 weeks to build up a steady supply, and Opal said that was fine. That steady mattered more to her than fast. Iris drove home and sat in the truck in front of the house for a minute, the way she had started doing whenever a number needed thinking through without the farm demanding something of her at the same time. 32 cents. 10 eggs a day was close to 6 dozen a week. 6 dozen a week at 32 cents was better than her father's wheat had returned in any of the 3 driest years since he died, and it came off 12 birds instead of 40 acres of ground that needed rain she couldn't order up. She wrote to the county extension office in July, describing the barring, the rose comb, the low, close-set frame of the birds, and asking whether anyone kept documented records on breeds matching the description. The answer came back 5 weeks later from an agent named Corwin Voss, who explained, in the flat and careful language of a man who dealt mostly in soil samples and seed counts, that what she described sounded consistent with an old dual-purpose breed developed generations back in the northeastern states. A breed that had been common on nearly every American farm before the war and had nearly vanished afterward, when the big hatcheries stopped bothering with anything that didn't fit a production line built for speed instead of hardiness. A small, scattered network of breeders, he wrote, had spent the better part of the last 15 years trying to keep what remained of the line from disappearing for good, cataloging flocks wherever they turned up. As far as his office's records showed, there wasn't a single documented flock of it anywhere in Oakridge County. She was, in other words, the only person for 100 miles who had what she had. She wrote back and asked, plainly, what breeding stock like hers might be worth to anyone try to rebuild the line. Voss wrote back asking if she'd drive to the county seat so he could see the flock's paperwork and photographs in person before he put a figure to anything official. She went the following Thursday, the notebook and a folder of photographs on the seat beside her, and found the extension office smaller than she'd pictured. A single low building behind the courthouse, a waiting room that smelled of coffee and old carpet, a bulletin board layered thick with seed catalogs and Grange meeting notices. Corwin Voss turned out to be a narrow, unhurried man in his 50s who studied her photographs for a long while before he said anything at all, laying them out across his desk in a row like a hand of cards he was still deciding how to play. You kept records from the start, he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a question. My father kept a notebook for the wheat, she said. I didn't have wheat worth tracking most years. I had this instead. He asked her a dozen questions. Hatch rates, comb type across generations, whether she'd lost any birds to the January freeze, how she'd housed them relative to her other stock, and wrote her answers down in a hand as careful as his letters had been. When he was done, he sat back and looked at her the way Opal Finn had looked at the yolk in the bowl, recalculating something in real time. There's maybe 6 documented flocks of this line left in the whole region, he said. Most of them held by breeders in their 70s who started keeping them before the war and never stopped. You're the youngest source flock I've logged in 11 years doing this job, and the only one anybody's found west of the river in longer than that. He slid a sheet of figures across the desk, verified breeding pair values, hatching egg rates, what his program could commit to purchasing over the coming 2 seasons if the line held. Most people who bring me a photograph of an odd chicken are hoping I'll tell them it's worth something. You're the first one in a long while where I get to actually say yes. She drove home with the figures folded in her coat pocket, past the co-op where the Tullis brothers had laughed at her back in April, and did not stop in. She did not need to. She understood, driving past it, that she had not bought 14 chickens to prove anything to the Tullis brothers, and that the fact she no longer needed to stop and settle that particular account was its own kind of answer. Silas was at the fence when she came out to check the mail flag a second time that evening, as if the figures might have changed by looking at them again. He read her face before she said a word. What, he said. She handed him the figures instead of answering. He read it once, then a second time, more slowly, the way he read anything that mattered to him. This is what the county will pay per verified pair, he said, if the line breeds true, if the birds carry the barring and the comb clean. You've got 12 hens, Iris. I'll have closer to 40 adult birds by next spring, if the hatch rate holds where it's been running this summer. Of those, most should breed true enough to sell as verified stock. I keep a core flock here for eggs, sell the surplus as breeding pairs, and start supplying hatching eggs to anybody in 3 counties who wants to start a line of their own. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of a man revising an opinion faster than he was entirely comfortable admitting to. You've worked this whole thing out already. I've been working out since March, she said. I just didn't have the number to finish the sum until today. He was quiet, looking past her at the coop, at the birds moving through the run with that same unhurried, deliberate alertness she'd first seen through the slats of a dealer's crate. The Deacon place, he said finally. She knew the Deacon place. 80 acres bordering her west fence, creek frontage better than her own, a barn in decent shape, a house that needed work, sitting empty since old Perry Deacon had gone to live with his daughter that spring. It had been listed since April, and nobody had come near the asking price because the county was 2 years into a dry stretch and land was not what anyone was buying in a dry stretch. "What about it?" she said. "What would you do with it if you had it?" She looked west, past her own fence line, toward the creek she couldn't currently reach. "Better water for a bigger flock. Barn's the right size to double what I've got here without crowding the birds. The house I'd let sit or rent out until I needed it for something else." She paused, doing the arithmetic out loud now, instead of just in her head, a habit she was only beginning to let herself have again after 2 years of doing it silently. The soils rested 2 seasons. It'd carry grain to feed a bigger flock without me buying in corn I can't always afford. Silas didn't say anything right away. When he did, his voice had a different edge to it than the concerned one she'd gotten used to over 2 years. "That's not the Deacon asking price." "Not yet. Not yet," she agreed. "By spring, with the extension letter and the egg money and the first breeding pairs sold, it's close. If the fall hatch confirms what I think it'll confirm, it's closer than either of us would have guessed back in March." "You were certain in March," he said. "For dollars. Birds nobody local wanted. Laughed it outright at the co-op, if I recall." "I was certain," she said. "Certainty doesn't get more certain with time, Silas. It just turns out to be right or it doesn't. And you don't get to know which until after you've already spent the money." He looked at the coop a while longer, and something in his face settled into a shape she hadn't seen on him before. Not the watchfulness, not the recalibrating look, but something closer to a man recalculating exactly what he'd been doing at that fence line twice a week for 2 years, and not entirely liking how long it had taken him to say so out loud. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a farm at the point when a person stops asking permission, not of anyone else, but of themselves, to take an unlikely thing seriously. It rarely arrives as a single decision. More often it arrives the way weather changes, in increments too small to notice until the whole sky has turned. A person spends 2 years being careful, because careful is what survival requires of them. And then one Tuesday morning they're standing at a feed counter doing arithmetic they already know does not balance, and they do the thing anyway. What separates that moment from recklessness is not confidence. It is attention, the plain willingness to actually look at what is in front of you rather than at what you were told by everyone around you to expect. What does a person owe the unlikely thing sitting quietly in their own life? The one everyone else has already decided isn't worth the trouble of a second look. Briar Hollow had seen strange chickens come and go before. It had rarely seen anyone willing to bet the last $4 of a household account on the difference between looking and truly seeing. August brought a hard scare before it brought anything good. A red fox took 2 hens from the run in a single night, slipping a gap in the wire Iris had meant to mend for a week and hadn't found the hours for. She found the feathers at first light, counted what remained twice to be sure, and stood in the coop a long moment feeling the particular cold drop of a person watching a fragile plan take its first real hit. She did not cry over it, though she came close. She mended the wire that morning before she did anything else, dug the bottom edge 18 inches into the ground the way her father had always sworn by, and she had never once bothered to do herself, and told no one but the notebook. Silas noticed, anyway, the way he noticed most things about her fences by then. He came by that Saturday with a roll of hardware cloth he said he'd had left over from his own runs, which she suspected was not entirely true, and the two of them dug the new trench together along the exposed side of the coop, without either one mentioning why it was suddenly necessary. It was the first afternoon they had worked side by side rather than talked across a fence, and something about the silence of it, companionable rather than careful, sat differently than any of their Saturday conversations had. By September, with the wire secured and the flock steady at 12 laying hens and 2 young roosters coming into their own barring, Iris began the breeding pens in earnest, pinning her strongest hens with the better of the 2 roosters and keeping careful notes on which pairings threw the cleanest barring and the tightest combs. It was slower work than she'd expected, patient work, the kind that rewarded watching more than it rewarded hurrying, and she found she did not mind it. She had spent 2 years hurrying through everything, trying to outrun the sense that the farm was slipping through her hands one bad week at a time. The breeding pens asked her to slow down instead, to notice which bird favored which trait, to trust that the answer would come in its own season rather than on her schedule. A hard freeze hit Oakridge County in late January, the kind that dropped overnight and stayed a week, cracking the frost line deep enough to burst a section of pipe at the Merrick place. Iris lost sleep over the coop more than she lost it over anything else that winter, certain the cold would take a toll on birds that had never wintered a season on her land before. She checked the coop twice a night for 4 nights running, expecting frostbitten combs, expecting losses. She found none. The rose combs, low and close to the skull, simply did not catch the frost the way an ordinary single comb would have. She understood only then, watching it happen rather than reading about it in Corwin Voss's letters, exactly why a breed built 2 generations back for hard New England winters had been the right birds, by accident or by her father's old instinct, to have bought it all. She wrote the observation down in the notebook, underlined it, and did not mention it to Silas until he noticed for himself, checking his own flock losses against hers over coffee one February morning and coming up short by comparison. "You didn't lose a single bird," he said, not quite a question. "Not one. My layers lost 3 to frostbite just on the comb alone. Different birds," she said, "built for a different kind of cold than what most folks around here keep." She did not say it to prove anything. She said it because it was simply true, and because 2 years of running the farm alone had taught her that the truest things were usually the ones worth saying plainly, without dressing them up as a lesson for someone else to learn. The first breeding results came in by early October. 9 of the 11 chicks hatched from the strongest pairing carried the barring clean through to the skin, and of those, 7 showed the low rose comb without a trace of the single comb creeping back in. She wrote to Corwin Voss with the numbers. His reply, when it came, held in order 6 verified breeding pairs for the Extension Program's own conservation flock, plus a formal request to list the Calder farm as a documented source population for the breed going forward, the first one recorded anywhere in Oakridge County. She made an offer on the Deacon place in November, low enough to account for the dry years, but serious enough that Perry Deacon's daughter, handling the sale from 2 states away, accepted it inside a week. Iris had the deed by the first hard frost, a year and 9 months after she had stood at a feed counter with $4 and a crate of strange, barred chicks that nobody local had wanted enough to bid against her for. Silas came to supper most Saturdays that winter, not everyone. He had his own 80 acres and his own December to get through. But most, he had taken, sometime in October, to coming around the back of the house instead of waiting at the fence, which was a door she had noticed him choosing without either of them remarking on aloud. They talked about grain rotation for the Deacon acreage and the Extension office's second letter, which had arrived with a formal order for 6 pairs and a request to expand the source flock, and about the creek access on the Deacon's side, which she planned to use come spring for a second run of birds once the barn there was properly divided. By the following fall, the flock across both properties numbered past 90 birds. The Extension Office's conservation program had placed the Calder name alongside 4 other verified flocks in the region, and Opal Finn was buying more eggs from her than from any other supplier who came through the store. Iris sat at the kitchen table one October evening with the account book open in front of her, the total in it larger than any number her father had ever managed to leave written down in his own hand. And Silas came in through the back door, the door he used now without needing to ask, and sat across from her without needing to be told what she was looking at. "The account," he said. "The account," she said, and turned it so he could see the total. He was quiet for a moment, the way he'd been quiet at the fence line more than a year before. $4, he said. 14 chickens nobody local wanted. Laughed it outright at the co-op. $4, she agreed. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her. She realized now, for longer than either of them had said plainly. Not the concerned look, not the recalibrating look, but something that had been arriving slowly since a Saturday afternoon digging fence trench in silence, and had simply taken its time getting all the way there. "The Deacon barn," he said. "You said you divide it come spring." "I did." My North 40 runs right up to that same creek, he said. I've been thinking on whether it makes more sense as one operation than two, going forward. Not just the fence line. All of it. She looked at him across the table, at the account book between them, at the window behind him where the last of the barred hens were settling into the coop for the night, making the low, unhurried sound they made at dusk, a sound she had come to recognize, after 2 years, as the particular sound of something that had turned out to be worth exactly what she'd hoped it might be, and had never once needed anyone else's permission to become it. Come around Saturday, she said, with the survey map. Saturday, he said. Outside, in the last of the light, one of the original 14. Older now, her barring gone slightly ragged at the edges the way a bird's does after a few good seasons of laying. Stepped up onto the fence rail and settled there, unbothered, watching the yard the way she always had. Not as though she belonged to it by accident, but as though she had simply always known, from the first morning in a stranger's crate, that she would. Iris never went back to argue with anyone who'd laughed at her. She didn't need to. If you're watching this, maybe you've had a version of those $4 in your own life. Something everyone told you wasn't worth a second look, that you took seriously anyway. What was it? Thank you for spending this time in Briar Hollow with us. We'll see you in Oakridge County again soon.